L'kol zman ve'etz, l'kol chafetz tachat hashamayim. A season is set for everything, and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to harvest. A time to mourn and a time to dance. 3,000 years ago, there lived a king in Jerusalem named Solomon. His father David was the warrior poet who had composed the 150 Psalms to God. Solomon, too, had the poet's gift. Tradition says that as a young man, he wrote the Song of Songs, the Bible's great love poem, all scented in exotic perfumes and fragrant orchards. Much later in his life, Solomon is said to have written the book of Kohelet, also called Ecclesiastes, from which the simple and enduring words that I began with, an affirmation of life's ever-changing seasons, comes: a time to mourn and a time to dance. My grandmother Grace, for whom our Gracie is named, was a calligrapher who made many beautiful prints of these couplets, always laid out in swirling, intersecting circles. In the 1960s, the folk troubadour Pete Seeger added the words, "Turn, turn, turn," to the biblical lines, and they became one of the most beloved anthems of that era. In the 20th century, another Jerusalem poet's genius would rival that of David and Solomon. Born with the singularly unfortunate name of Ludwig Pfuffer, in Würzburg, Germany in 1924, the boy who would become known as Yehuda Amichai moved with his family to Eretz Yisrael and to the growing city of Petach Tikva in 1935. Like many of his era, his gravestone bore not 2, but 3 dates: the date of his birth, the date of his aliyah, and the date of his death. During those years, Amichai witnessed the realization of the Jewish people's greatest dream in the rebirth of the State of Israel, and also some of our most terrible nightmares: the Shoah that consumed his family who stayed behind in Europe, and the seemingly endless series of wars he served as a soldier in 4 of them that have, for the last 76 years, been the terrible price of our people's liberation. Amichai, in his life, wrote 11 volumes of poetry, weaving his verses from fragments of ancient biblical metaphor and prosaic moments of modern life in his beloved Jerusalem. In one of my favorites of his poems, he turns his characteristic Israeli chutzpah on Solomon himself and offers a different take on Kohelet's famous summation. It's called A Man in His Life. A man in his life doesn't have time to have a time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have a season for every purpose. Kohelet was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the very same moment, to laugh and to cry with the very same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, to hate and forgive and remember and forget all that which takes history years upon long years to do. Amichai teaches us that our lives are not so neatly divided into seasons, one time set for finding, another for losing. Instead, we are always holding so many truths, so many feelings, so many realities, all at once. I'm thinking of the mom who told me about cheering wildly at her child's soccer game. And at the very same time as she's standing up and jumping up and down cheering, she is feeling so acutely the painful recent loss of her own mother, who never missed one of those games. I'm thinking of the Shiva house I attended this year, where the families told the old stories, and over again they shifted from tears to laughter and back again and again. I'm thinking of the ways that in the darkest times in our lives, we are often just so overcome with a sense of blessed gratitude, reflecting on those little everyday acts of love that are shown to us by our friends and community. And of the way that even under the chuppah, we shatter a glass and say, at this moment of bliss, even now, there is such brokenness in the world. We began our service last night with Naomi Shemer's beloved Israeli folk song, Al Kol Eila, which sums up the same message. Al hadvash v'ala oketz, al hamar v'hamatok, for the honey and the sting, for the bitter and the sweet. Not one season for bitterness and another for sweet, but somehow kol eila, all of it, always at the very same time. 1 year ago this week, 4,000 beautiful souls, each one a stranger to me, but every face as familiar as a not-so-distant cousin, gathered in the fields of Kibbutz Re'im to dance until dawn. They were nurses, teachers, and soldiers, and high-tech workers, and some very cool grandparents. It was a night of love, peace, and such utter freedom. Survivors talk about watching the perfect sunset, perfect sunrise coming up over the desert. And then at 6:29 a.m., the music abruptly stopped as rocket trails appeared in the sky, followed by unimaginable nightmare. 4,000 people danced that night. 400 never left. At the very same time, terrorists were flooding into Be'eri and Kfar Aza and Nir Oz, and so many of the surrounding communities. We know the numbers. More than 1,200 dead. More than 250 abducted into Gaza. The worst day in our people's memory in more than 70 years. A horror which has yielded in its wake horror upon horror in a war that seems impossibly no closer to conclusion. And 101 hostages today who are impossibly not yet home. To be part of the Jewish family this year has been to live a season of collective grief, but a strange season for us. While Israeli society continues to reel and churn with rockets and sirens and safe rooms, and 70,000 still displaced and many more called into military service, and massive demonstrations on the streets, demanding, screaming, begging for solutions. To be an American Jew, it seems to me, has been to inhabit an eerie, parallel planet in which everything is quietly normal, but nothing is. To go about one's day as usual, only to close your eyes at night and see again Noah being carried away on the back of that motorbike, her arms outstretched for someone, anyone. To see Shiri Bibas's eyes as she gripped Mother Bear tight, her two little red-headed boys, whose pictures are still up on that wall. To get dressed in the morning and to add a yellow ribbon or a dog tag or a little piece of masking tape over the heart, as Cantor Amy has done every single day, as that number grows unimaginably bigger and bigger. To smile and chat with the extremely pleasant non-Jewish neighbors and their friends who invited us over for a Labor Day potluck, and in the course of 3 hours of conversation, never made mention of a peace-loving 23-year-old named Hirsch, who had been buried that morning, hours before, by parents whose fierce grace had shaken heaven and earth and had still not brought home their son alive. To hold space in the midst of deep familial grief, to try to wrap our minds around and to try to open our hearts to the unconscionable and unimaginable number of children of Gaza, who our Jewish hearts and souls know are made every bit as much in the image of God as our own children, and deserve so very much better than this. To live with so many questions with simply no good answers. To walk the whole year, a whole year, in the valley of the shadow of death, carrying it all like a stone in our hearts. When we are in grief, collective or personal, it feels like the whole world should stop in its tracks, doesn't it? How dare we go about business as usual? The supermarket? The dry cleaner? Our chores, our ordinary days, when the world has been so completely thrown off of its axis, shouldn't everything grind to a stop? But it doesn't. The world doesn't work that way. It's true that our people's heart has ached this year more than at any point in most of our lifetimes. But even with aching Jewish hearts, and in no small part because of them, we have lived such vibrantly alive Jewish lives this year. In our little corner of the deepest diaspora, we have gathered here again and again and again to fill this sanctuary with gorgeous song and deep prayer and words of Torah. Last year, our community added 60 new families to its midst, 40 more so far this year. We have celebrated together new loves and the growing up of children and the addition of so many little babies to our midst, each of them an affirmation of our best hopes and another reason to pray for peace. Many in our community, including, I'm proud to say, my own father, have gone to Israel to volunteer. And many here have been champions in the fight against hate at home, at school board meetings and faculty senates and city council meetings and on the streets. And we have all watched out for each other. We have been more, forgive me, Jacob, than a village. We've been mishpacha. We've been family. a safe haven to refill our cups, to renew our sense of belonging when we have really needed it the most. And you know the thing, what's happened in our little community? It's been repeated in hundreds, in thousands of communities across the Jewish world. Synagogues everywhere are packed with newcomers. Some of you haven't been to high holidays in a long time, but you had the sense, you knew that this was the year that you needed to be with your people. There are hundreds, thousands like you. Conversion programs have seen a record-smashing year. The program I ran for a decade in Los Angeles had more than 900 students in it last year, close to 3 times the usual numbers, all choosing to cast their lots with ours, even at this time, especially at this time. A dear friend, an Israeli tattoo artist living in Los Angeles, recently told me that she is completely overwhelmed by requests from people, young and old, who all want the words Am Yisrael Chai literally inscribed in their flesh. Over the last 3 weeks of Shloshim, the number of Israeli children being given the name Hirsch has skyrocketed. We don't have time in our lives to have a time for everything. It's been a season of death and despair, of horror and tragedy, and it has also been a season of unstoppable, unshakable, indomitable life. My mind goes back to that very first morning. As news reports flooded in from Israel, the clergy and synagogue leadership quickly huddled to discuss what would be done about Simchat Torah that night. Simchat Torah is meant to be a raucous outpouring of joy, a celebration of another year's journey through our people's story. As we have for the last several years, we had booked mostly kosher. Our beloved Liav Sofer's incredible klezmer meets bluegrass band, who still played the record-holding longest hora in history at Anne and my wedding. There was going to be a much-needed open bar at the end of a long Yontif season, and I already had planned out my schedule over the course of the night to stay rabbinic and also have just some fun. Now we wondered whether it was appropriate to gather at all. As families waited for word of their loved ones and the whole Jewish world reeled in shock, how in the world were we supposed to dance when the dead from the dance festival were yet to be counted? We didn't have a lot of time to discuss, nor frankly a lot of mental energy from a sleepless night to truly weigh the pros and cons. And so we decided to go ahead, unsure of what it would feel like, but on the intuition that it was better to be together than apart. As I left the house, I turned to Anne and said, "There'll either be 15 people here tonight or 150. I was wrong. More than 250 of you packed the courtyard that night. We stood huddled close together, partially simply from lack of space, but much more, I think, from a desire to be close. We traditionally start our celebration by unrolling the entire Torah scroll, standing shoulder to shoulder in a circle with our fingertips holding the entire parchment unfurled for all to see. The scroll we brought out for that moment was our Czech Survivor Torah, scribed more than a century ago, that sits as a constant witness in our sanctuary, and that's all that remains of the destroyed Jewish community of Brno. At the end of the Second World War, massive Nazi warehouses were discovered full of Sifrei Torah, each one meticulously preserved and cataloged for what our murderers had planned to be museums to the extinct Jewish race. Instead, we held that living parchment in our living Jewish hands. Preschoolers sat on their parents' shoulders. Little kids darted around the circle, checking out the strange and beautiful black letters against the white parchment, while grandparents and great-grandparents looked proudly on. We were joined by a group of college kids from UCI and Chapman, Intro to Judaism students experiencing their first ever Simchat Torah. The whole rich life of our extended family stood side by side that night, grasping hold of a story of a people who has known so much suffering, but also so much resilient strength, who once long ago dared to leave behind a darkness and seek a promised land for ourselves and for our kids, and have done it again and again and again for the 3,000 years since. And then we danced. We danced a dance of defiance. We danced a dance of strength. We danced a dance of unity. We danced a dance of enduring life. We danced with tears of mourning in our eyes that night, but we danced nonetheless. We danced because the great dance of the Jewish people cannot be silenced, because the forces that seek our destruction do not get to win that kind of victory. We danced carrying with us those who we lost and those who survived, the Nitzolei Nova, the ones who have made their heroic rallying cry, Anachnu nirkod shuv. We will dance again. Several months after that terrible and sacred Simchat Torah, our community was privileged to host my teacher, Rabbi Sharon Brous, founding rabbi of the Ikar community and author of the book, The Amen Effect. Her book is the product of 20 years spent in hospital rooms and houses of mourning, and it's a passionate plea to show up for one another, to be witness to each other's pain, to offer, when there's truly nothing else to give, the healing grace of presence. At the center of her extraordinary book is a passage from the Mishnah, the first collection of rabbinic writings composed in the years that followed another communal tragedy, the loss of the Second Temple. In the Mishnah and Tractate Midot, the rabbis recount with exacting specificity the layout of the temple, its gates and porticos, its sacred vessels and holy rites. They do their best to remember every detail of their lost world, to leave to their descendants a record of the glory that once stood at the heart of our people. They tell us there that 3 times a year, every Israelite from across the land would converge on that temple laden with their offerings, that they would climb the colossal southern steps 200 feet wide to accommodate the massive swell of pilgrims, that when they reached the Huldah gate in the temple complex, they would enter and they would turn to the right, and they would walk a counterclockwise circuit around the top of that flat holy mountain, visiting each requisite station in sequence, immersing for purity, paying their temple dues, dropping off their sacrifices with the Kohanim, and exiting back out where they had begun. This great circular flowing of humanity, lehogeg in Hebrew, is the origin of our word today for festival, Chag, a sacred circling. All would enter and turn to the right except for one group, those whose hearts were weighted down with recent grief. Those ones, the mourners, would climb the same steps and enter the same gate, but instead they would turn to the left, and they would walk a clockwise path. And as they progressed neged hazerem, against the stream, the assembled community would look in their faces and stop and offer blessings of comfort. May the one whose spirit dwells in this house be with you and your family, they would say. To walk the mourner's path, as our Slichot teacher, Rabbi Ann Brenner, once called it, was to open yourself up to receive the support of community from neighbors and strangers alike, who all knew that one day they too would be the ones circling to the left. A month ago, when we came out of Shabbat to the awful news of 6 hostages murdered, Hirsch along with Eden, Uri, Almog, Alex, and Carmel, our community decided to hold a night of virtual Shiva. It was a last-minute plan, and very quickly our Zoom account, which maxes out at 100 screens, was completely filled. Cantor Amy led a beautiful Mariv service and sang Hatikva. And when it came my turn to share some words, I found myself surprised by a question that arose in my mind that I had never once asked before. What happens when everyone, the entire Jewish community, is all circling to the left at the same time? What happens when there's no one standing on solid ground who can look at us with eyes of compassion and bless us that we find peace? What happens when a whole community mourns? We are all circling to the left. For a year, we have all been circling to the left. And as the question arose, so too did the answer. What do? We hold hands and we walk together, step by painful step, offering each other strength as we go. When one starts to falter, we catch them. When one starts to cry, we hold them and we let our tears mingle. We are not separate. We are not separate. The whole and the broken, the blesser and the blessed. No one in a season of joy to balance another's season of sorrow. Instead, we share in it all together, all at the very same time. To be a Jew in this terrible year is to have been among the walking wounded, but still upright, still seeking a way forward. To be a human in this broken, beautiful, fragile world is to live each day with both the dvash and the oketz, the honey and the sting, the mar and the matok, the bitter and the sweet, all at the very same time. And as I picture that scene, all of us circling together, all of us circling to the left, Ki'ish echad, belev echad, as one people, with one battered but still beating heart, it seems to me that it forms a great dance, doesn't it? A Simchat Torah hakafa, a festival mosh pit dedicated to peace and love and freedom, an unbroken circle of grief and love and defiant, holy, hope-filled life. It's a time to mourn. It's also a time to dance. It's always all of them, all at the very same time.
To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to laugh, and a time to weep. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to build up, a time to break down, a time to dance, and a time to mourn, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together, a time of war and a time of peace, a time of love, a time of hate, a time you may embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to gain, a time to lose, a time to rend, and a time to sow, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time of peace, and I pray it's not too late. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time to every purpose under heaven.